They said the job was cursed. 16 assistants in a single month, most left crying before their lunch break. Victor Costello was a paralyzed, ruthless crime lord who chewed people up for sport. But he never expected Juliet, a desperate, overweight single mother who absolutely refused to be broken. If you drove up the winding, frost-covered roads of the Hudson Valley in the winter of 2019, you might catch a glimpse of the Costello estate. Hidden behind wrought-iron gates and towering pines, it looked like a fortress. And in many ways it was. Inside sat Victor Costello, former undisputed king of the New York underground, now confined to a custom-built wheelchair. 2 years prior, a car bomb meant to end his life had only succeeded in severing his spine. It left him paralyzed from the waist down, steeped in chronic pain and vibrating with a bitter, explosive rage. Victor terrified his enemies, but he terrorized his staff. Since his accident, the mansion had a revolving door of personal assistants. They were usually young, timid, and entirely unprepared for a boss who would throw hot coffee at the wall because it was brewed 2 degrees too cold. No one lasted a day. Enter Juliet Jenkins. Juliet was 28, a single mother to a severely asthmatic 6-year-old boy named Leo, and she was at the absolute end of her rope, drowning in medical debt and facing eviction from her cramped apartment in Queens. Juliet didn't have the luxury of being intimidated. She was also a big woman, fat, curvy, carrying the physical weight of her struggles alongside the emotional ones. Society often made her feel invisible, or worse, treated her as an easy target for ridicule. But motherhood had forged her spine out of titanium. When the desperate temp agency sent her to the Costello estate, the recruiter, a nervous woman named Brenda, practically begged her to just survive. Until 5 p.m. "If you finish out the day, it's $1,000 bonus," Brenda had whispered over the phone. $1,000 meant Leo's inhalers. It meant groceries. It meant survival. When Juliet arrived at the sprawling mansion, the heavy mahogany doors were opened by Bruno, a hulking bodyguard with a scar across his jaw. He took one look at Juliet, at her worn-out, thrift store sensible shoes, her wide hips, and the cheap, poorly fitting blazer she wore over her thick frame, and smirked. "You lost, sweetheart," Bruno grunted, leaning against the doorframe. The kitchen staff enters through the back. Juliet didn't blink. She adjusted her battered tote bag on her shoulder. "I'm the new executive assistant. Now are you going to let me freeze on the porch, or are you going to do your job and show me to Mr. Costello?" Bruno's smirk vanished. He stepped aside, muttering under his breath, and led her through the labyrinthine halls of the estate. The air inside was suffocating heavy with the smell of expensive cigars and unspoken fear. She was led into a massive, dimly lit library. Sitting behind a sprawling oak desk was Victor Costello. He was a striking man in his late 30s with sharp features and cold, hollow eyes. The moment Juliet stepped into the room, Victor didn't even look up from his ledgers. "Get out!" Victor rasped his voice like grinding stones. "I haven't even introduced myself," Juliet replied calmly, walking closer. Victor finally looked up. His eyes scanned her up and down, dripping with undisguised contempt. "I don't care who you are. You're not cut out for this. You'll be crying in your car in 20 minutes. I asked for a competent assistant, not a whatever this is. Get out before I have Bruno toss you out." To emphasize his point, Victor violently swept his arm across the desk. A heavy crystal whiskey tumbler shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass flying just inches from Juliet's cheap shoes. Silence echoed in the massive room. Victor waited for the inevitable tears. He waited for her to run. Instead, Juliet let out a long, exhausted sigh, the exact same sigh she used when her 6-year-old threw his toys at the wall. She calmly walked over to a nearby closet, retrieved a broom and dustpan, and walked back to the desk. "I'm fat, Mr. Costello, not fragile," Juliet said, her voice deadpan as she began sweeping up the glass. "And if you think a broken cup is going to scare off a woman who has wrestled a screaming toddler into a snowsuit at 6 a.m. on 3 hours of sleep, you are severely overestimating your intimidation tactics." Victor froze. For the first time in 2 years, the paralyzed mafia boss was completely, utterly speechless. "Now," Juliet said, dumping the glass into a wastebasket and pulling out a notepad. "I need your schedule for the week, the contacts for your physical therapists, and I suggest you use your words next time you're upset. Throwing things is for children." Victor stared at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Slowly, a dark, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his lips. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the stupidest." "I'm a mother with rent due," Juliet replied flatly. "What's my first task?" Against all odds. Juliet survived the first day. Then she survived the first week. Her presence in the Costello estate was an anomaly that sent ripples through the underground syndicate. Victor was relentless, pushing her to her physical and mental limits. He would deliberately schedule meetings on the opposite ends of the massive estate, forcing Juliet to hustle her heavy frame up and down the long corridors. He would bark cruel insults about her weight, her clothes, her background. But Juliet was a fortress. When he mocked her size, she didn't shrink. "If my weight is the most interesting thing you can insult, you're losing your edge, boss," she told him one Tuesday, casually reorganizing his confidential files. "Now do you want to review the shipping manifests from the docks, or do you want to keep giving me diet advice you read in a magazine?" Slowly the dynamic began to shift. Victor's cruelty turned into a bizarre, gruff form of respect. He realized Juliet's mind was razor-sharp. Because the guards, the capos, and the rival associates dismissed her as just a fat secretary, they spoke freely around her. Juliet soaked up everything. She caught a discrepancy in the accounting that saved Victor $250,000. She organized his chaotic life with maternal precision. But as the weeks bled into a brutal February, Juliet began to notice something terrifying. Victor was declining. On the days he was scheduled for physical therapy, he was lethargic, his speech slightly slurred, his sharp eyes clouded. The estate's private nurse, a slim, arrogant woman named Clara, claimed it was just the progression of his nerve damage and prescribed heavier painkillers. Clara openly despised Juliet. She would make sneering comments in the staff kitchen, laughing at Juliet's Tupperware lunches and tight clothes. But Juliet ignored the mean girl antics. Her focus was on Victor. Having nursed her own ailing grandmother through severe illness before she passed, Juliet knew what over-sedation looked like. One evening after the rest of the staff had turned in, Juliet stayed late in Victor's private study. She was supposed to be filing, but she watched him struggle to keep his head up over a chessboard. "You look terrible," Juliet noted, not mincing words. "Always a flatterer, Jenkins." Victor mumbled, rubbing his temples. "My legs. The phantom pain is worse. Clara gave me my pills an hour ago, just waiting for them to kick in." Juliet frowned. She walked over to his side table, where the little plastic cup of pills sat empty. She remembered the color of the capsules Clara usually administered. They were typically white and blue. But a faint, powdery residue at the bottom of the cup looked distinctly yellow. "Mr. Costello," Juliet said, her voice lowering. "Who handles the pharmacy pickups?" "Clara does." "Why?" Victor blinked, trying to focus on her. "Because I think you're being poisoned." Victor's head snapped up a flash of the old dangerous mafia boss cutting through the pharmaceutical haze. "Watch your mouth, Juliet. Clara has been with me for a year. And I've been with you for a month, and I'm telling you, someone is slipping you a sedative, Juliet insisted, planting her hands on her wide hips. You're a sitting duck. You're tired, you're compliant, and you're not paying attention to your territories. Who benefits if you're too weak to run the family? Before Victor could answer, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Bruno rushed in, his face pale, gripping a suppressed handgun. "Boss," Bruno panted, locking the door behind him. "We have a breach. The perimeter alarms on the east wing just got cut. 3 armed men just bypassed the outer gate." Victor tried to push himself up in his wheelchair, but his arms trembled violently. The drugs in his system were pulling him under. He cursed, slamming a fist against the armrest. I can't see straight. Bruno, get my piece from the safe." "The safe is on a time lock, boss. It's past midnight." Bruno panicked. Gunfire popped in the distance, a muffled, terrifying sound echoing through the massive halls of the mansion. The rivals had chosen tonight to strike, knowing the Iron Ghost was incapacitated. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her son Leo, sleeping in his bed miles away in Queens. She could not die here. She refused to leave her son an orphan. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the fireplace. "Bruno." Juliet ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a whip. "You take the door. Mr. Costello, get behind the mahogany desk. The wood is thickest there." Victor stared up at his overweight, underpaid assistant, wielding a fire poker like a broadsword, her eyes blazing with fierce maternal survival instinct. "You heard the woman," Victor growled to Bruno, fighting the heaviness in his eyelids. "Move!" The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. They were coming right for the study. The heavy oak doors of the study splintered inward with a deafening crash. Wood shards rained across the Persian rug as 2 men dressed in black tactical gear burst into the room, assault rifles raised. Bruno didn't hesitate. The hulking bodyguard fired twice, his suppressed weapon making a deadly thwip-thwip sound. The first intruder dropped instantly, a red bloom expanding across his chest. But the second attacker lunged forward, returning fire. A bullet grazed Bruno's shoulder, spinning the massive man around and sending him crashing into a glass display cabinet. Bruno. Juliet screamed, her maternal instincts completely overriding her fear. The remaining hitman swung his rifle toward Victor, who was still slumped behind the desk, fighting the heavy fog of the sedatives. The assassin sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He never saw Juliet coming. Operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, Juliet stepped out from the shadows of the bookshelf. She gripped the heavy wrought-iron fire poker with both hands, raised it like a baseball bat, and brought it down with every ounce of her weight behind it. The iron bar cracked brutally against the hitman's kneecap. The man shrieked, his leg buckling instantly. As he collapsed forward, his rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling plaster. Before he could recover, Juliet swung again, bringing the heavy brass handle of the poker down on the back of his skull. The assassin crumpled to the floor unconscious. Silence fell over the room, broken only by Bruno's ragged breathing and the ringing in Juliet's ears. She stood over the downed man, her chest heaving, the fire poker trembling in her grip. Victor leaned over his desk, his dark eyes wide, the lingering haze of the drugs temporarily burned away by the shock. He stared at his assistant, this curvy, exhausted single mother from Queens who had just taken down a cartel hitman with fireplace hardware. "Jenkins." Victor breathed out his voice, thick with disbelief. "Remind me never to mess with your son." Before they could catch their breath, a third set of footsteps echoed down the hall, moving rapidly in the opposite direction, away from the study toward the rear exit of the estate. "The alarms," Juliet gasped, dropping the poker. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with the speed of a woman used to balancing a checkbook on pennies. Someone on the inside had to shut down the perimeter. The drugs, the timing. Clara! The nurse! Bruno grunted, clutching his bleeding shoulder as he struggled to his feet. She wouldn't have the guts. She's been poisoning him for weeks, Juliet insisted, her eyes flashing with fury. And she's making a run for it. Without waiting for permission, Juliet sprinted out of the study. She knew the sprawling layout of the Costello estate better than anyone. She had spent the last month organizing it. She bypassed the grand staircase and cut through the servants' corridor, her sensible thrift store shoes squeaking against the polished marble. She intercepted Clara in the mudroom near the garage. The slim, arrogant nurse was frantically stuffing bundles of cash and 2 leather-bound ledgers into a duffel bag. "Going somewhere, Clara?" Juliet asked, blocking the exit. Clara jumped, dropping a stack of hundreds. When she saw it was only Juliet, her panic morphed into an ugly sneer. "Get out of my way, you fat cow. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Dominic Rossi is taking over the Costello territory tonight. Victor is a cripple. He's finished." "He might be in a chair," Juliet said, stepping forward, her broad shoulders squared. "But he's 10 times the man Dominic Rossi is. And you're just a coward slipping pills into a disabled man's tea." Clara pulled a small silver revolver from her coat pocket, aiming it directly at Juliet's chest. "I said move. Your weight might stop a lot of things, sweetie, but it won't stop a bullet." Juliet looked at the gun. She thought of her 6-year-old Leo. She thought of the hospital bills, the eviction notices,